Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode. Today we're going to talk about Neanderthals and early humans and multiple instances of their breeding. We're going to start to see more and more of these types of articles where there's going to be separate, unique instances where they find some evidence that a Neanderthal and a human had interbred. I think it started out with some out there theory, and then it gradually evolved to a confirmed case, and then now we're starting to see multiple cases. I think a lot of people could have predicted this just because, where there's smoke, there's fire, right, so to speak. I just think as I mentioned in the previous episode, not a lot of people are willing to go out on a limb and without any smoking gun evidence. So the fact that this headline's out suggests that there has been more than one instance that Neanderthals and modern Homo sapiens mated. And I think eventually it'll just change the whole entire theory and how we perceive our interactions with Neanderthals and other ancient ancient hominins. Just change the whole map here. Speaking of maps, here's this one here that I'd say it's pretty updated, but again, I don't agree with this map. But I think this is a map that's going to be changed a lot more and more when articles like this get published. Once they start to have a clearer picture of what was going on back then in terms of the genetics and how they were passed and where they went and stuff like that. So out of Africa is still in play here. A lot of people think, although there are people who think there's an out of Australia theory as well, but this graphic here is still out of Africa. And then apparently this orange group here were where the Neanderthals were living. And then Denisova Cave is basically the four corners over here. So you have Homo erectus in Asia and Southeast Asia, and then at the top we're seeing this blue here, which is the newly added Denisovans. And I think this is much closer to the truth than it was the past 10 or so years, 5 years, but it's still it's probably way more complicated than this. So anyway, my whole point was that discoveries like this are going to go a long way toward changing how we perceive those early interactions. So the early humans from Africa encountered Neanderthals living in parts of what is now Europe and Eastern Asia, and then they led to offspring, which presumably is us, their descendants rather. We are their descendants. This does make sense though, right? Because Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted for 30,000 years. Just one case of mating in 30,000 years, that doesn't make any sense to me. That doesn't add up. So it probably was widespread as well, because a lot of people living now, they have Neanderthal in them. Some Asian people have over 2% Neanderthal. It's going to be tough to reconstruct our genetic history and sort which genes came where in what part of the earth. I think once we get to the point where we have a really good idea where they came from, then a whole lot of stuff will start to make sense. So recent research by other groups had suggested that multiple offspring producing unions had occurred. Some people in East Asia, for example, were found to have up to 20% more Neanderthal DNA than people of strictly European descent. Some people have a significant amount rather, compared to other people on the other end of the spectrum who have very little Neanderthal DNA. That's indicative of a lot of things. That means more. In certain areas, there were more Neanderthal modern human pairings than in other areas. So in the areas where those pairings were numerous, then logic follows that they had more offspring in those areas, and therefore, over time, stretched out over thousands and thousands of years, they'll have population pool of people will have branched out enough, and they'll have spread their genes further, while keeping over 20% more than the people who had descended from groups that didn't have those Neanderthal modern human pairings. So how did they do this? So they pulled and analyzed data from 1,000 Genomes Project, measuring the amount of Neanderthal DNA and genetic material from volunteers. They separated the data between people of European and Asian ancestry, They did that because it would suggest that both groups had evidence of early multiple mating events. As I was saying earlier, so any group that had multiple earlier mating events in their genetic history, then it'll show up in the data today. After that, they studied the rates of the two groups by creating simulations showing outcomes of differing numbers of mating events between the two groups. Yeah, so this is where they start creating simulations, and they're using the machine learning algorithm to come up with this. So they fed this data that showed DNA. They fed this data into a machine learning algorithm, and then that showed the DNA percentage patterns based on the number of crossbreeding events that had occurred. So then they concluded from this that the most likely scenario was that there were multiple instances of crossbreeding between early humans in both East Asia and Europe with Neanderthals. If you look at this map here again, so they think this Neanderthal group here, when they made headway here, Homo erectus and Denisovans, they were already here, as well as modern humans, as evidenced by this earlier migration on the bottom. Based on this map, it does make sense then that people in East Asia would have all these Neanderthal genes. They would actually have a skewed amount of Neanderthal genes because all these multiple instances of crossbreeding here. So yeah, it makes sense that there were these pockets of this genetic richness, so to speak, of the people with Neanderthal DNA here. You can kind of see that in the genetics where the local populations where the Neanderthals were, after having crossbred with the anatomically modern humans here, they would have an increased concentration of people with the Neanderthal genome, which is basically what the learning algorithm showed. Let me know what you guys think about not only the genetic drift and stuff, but using learning simulations and algorithms to come up with this data. This is becoming more and more prevalent now. I think it's really interesting, and it does make a lot of sense when you look at it through the context of early humans and what people have been saying and speculating about for decades now. Yeah, just let me know what you guys think, and I think it's very likely that we're going to see more and more, like I said earlier, more and more of these instances of Neanderthal and human breeding. So before we end here, I want to go over one comment from the last video from David on YouTube, and he mentions the consumption of shellfish in terms of how the human body could impact rather the evolutionary process in a human consciousness. So the comment reads, people whose diet involved consumption of large quantities of shellfish or mussels would ingest a high intake of manganese. The region of the brain involved in performing mental arithmetic utilizes manganese. Such a diet may have promoted evolutionary process in the human consciousness. And I think that's a pretty good point, that more science needs to go into developing this data in this area, because maybe eating and ingesting these certain nutrients would push your body in a certain evolutionary path, so to speak. And so let's use a very loose analogy here, very loose example. Let's say we have an individual who is descended from a line of people who have eaten exclusively carbohydrates. Well, their body is going to change to better process carbohydrates in a more efficient and energy producing, like maximizing the energy output, so to speak. This is, again, David brings up a good point that I didn't bring up in the video. They have done certain studies about what Neanderthals were eating. I think I did a video about that, where they found this residue off of like a tooth or something like that, and they figured out part of their diet was, and they found out it was very high in protein and fats. And that's an interesting segue into doing some analysis like this, except looking for certain elements, right? Like in this case, he says manganese, right, in shellfish. And I think they should study more of those people as well, from that time period, who were living off the coast and fishing. Like in Chile, there were a population of people living there who were living off of the coast over there. And perhaps they were eating a lot of shellfish as well. The interesting thing is, though, about shellfish is in some In some religions, they ban that. They think it's a bad idea. You're prohibited from eating it in some religions, in some Judeo-Christian faiths. And I think that may have traced to people who had those allergies. That's an interesting tidbit. Shellfish itself seems to have been a very unique food and pretty polarizing in the sense that there's a whole religion out there banning it. So it probably had to do with people with allergies and people who would get really, really sick if they ate it. So they just added that into the religion to avoid that, because they wanted people to survive and pass on, have children and all that stuff. So it'd be a bad look for the religion if people started dying from shellfish. I know I'm diminishing the point a little bit, but I mean if you boil it down, that's the reason why people were dropping dead from eating shellfish. But yeah, maybe there is a population, David, that had their evolution change. I mean, if the environment does it, it makes sense that the diet would have an effect as well, right? So anyway, leave a comment, subscribe, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.